This is lesson 89 and this one's all about fiscal policy. Now obviously on the course we've already spoken a lot about fiscal policy. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through the detail of what the pattern of economic activity is. Why does the government spend money? Why does the government have taxation? What sort of taxation systems should we be using? What's good about VAT? What's good about increasing VAT? What's bad about increasing VAT? I'm just going to go through the details of fiscal policy rather than looking at the big picture. Okay. Candidates should be able to assess the level and distribution of public expenditure. Now I've often seen that come up in the exams and students have come out and say, well, what the hell does that mean? Right, okay, so the level of public expenditure is really just about increasing aggregate demand, and obviously if you increase aggregate demand you get rid of a negative output gap, you draw a diagram of it, you're going to get more growth and less unemployment. So the level is, how do you change the level of national income? So obviously we can increase G or we can decrease taxes, which will increase AD, or we can do the opposite, and that's what it means. Okay, the next one is the distribution of public expenditure. What do we spend our money on? Now, of course, we can spend our money on green technology, we can spend more money on roads, we can spend more money on broadband, or we can give teachers more money, or we can spend money on the aging population. So the distribution of public expenditure is what should the government be spending its money on? And there's clearly there's a big debate on right now is that the government should be trying to reduce revenue expenditure. So there's been massive cuts in the police force, there's been cuts in education, and that's revenue expenditure. Now therefore when that happens, the public sector has to become more innovative in the way it delivers its services. However, at the same time, we should be spending more on capital expenditure, which is on roads, on rail, on broadband, because that's an intervention supply side policy, more investment, and that will shift out the long run aggregate supply curve. Okay, so that's that part of the course done. The next bit is fiscal policy has microeconomic functions as well as macroeconomic functions. So obviously we always think of fiscal policy as increasing AD, and that changes the level of national income, so therefore we can increase national income. However, the definition of supply side economics is using microeconomic incentives to achieve macro goals. And just to give you a few policies, we can decrease income tax, that will make individuals work harder, a greater incentive to go out to work. We can decrease welfare benefits. If we decrease welfare benefits, that will reduce the replacement ratio. That will give individuals a greater incentive to go out to work. If we decrease corporation tax, more people would want to go into business. That creates more enterprise. It also maybe creates more investment. So therefore the firms will work more effectively. So this is individuals working more effectively, firms working more effectively. So we can use microeconomic incentives by making individuals, firms, the banks work more effectively, create more enterprise, and that will create macro goals of improving the AS curve, which therefore means we can run the economy at high levels of demand. So those are the microeconomic functions of an economy. How can fiscal policy be used to increase aggregate demand? Pretty straightforward. Okay, we can increase AD, increase G, that increases AD. We can decrease G and that decreases AD. We can increase taxes and that will increase AD. Or we can decrease taxes and that will, increase taxes, that will obviously decrease AD, or we can decrease taxes and that will increase AD. Sorry, you've just been filming the back of my head for the last few minutes, and you probably recognise that I'm going board on top. Right, the first time I realised I was going board on top was when I put myself on camera. I never knew that before, which is probably a good thing. How fiscal policy can be used to influence AS? Right, there are loads and loads on here that we can think of. Okay, so we can decrease income tax, we can decrease corporation tax. I'm now trying to look at the camera at all times. We can decrease welfare benefits. We can use interventionist supply side. Have I got that down here? No, you can use interventionist supply side, pretty important one. We can spend loads of money on capital expenditure, roads, rail, broadband, all of those sorts of things. So there's lots of policies which will actually increase aggregate demand, but will also influence the supply side performance of the economy. I've always thought that they might ask the question, which is more important, in terms of fiscal policy? Is it supply side or demand side? Well, an easy way to answer that question is they are both as important as each other. However, I suppose in reality maybe the supply side functions are more important because that's the only way in which we can shift out the AS curve and grow. However, at certain times the demand side will be more important if you've got a negative output gap, and at certain times the supply side will be more important, say, if you've got a positive output gap, although it will take a long time to work its way through the economy. Right, the next one on there is how can government spending and taxation affect the pattern of economic activity? Now, when this came up in the exam, everybody got it wrong because no one really knew what the pattern of economic activity was. But the government has an amazing power to work with the free market and change the ways in which we make decisions. E.g., it could tax processed food. By taxing processed food, that would make everybody healthier. It wouldn't go down particularly well with the population at large because they say, well, we should be able to eat what we want to eat. But maybe the government has a better overall picture of what should happen. So therefore, the government can change the pattern of economic activity, and it does this through taxes and subsidies. So we tax demerit good, those goods with negative externalities, and we subsidise merit goods, perhaps even green technology, if you're an environmentalist. Or we can increase G, and we can increase G on capital expenditure. Okay, I think you're pretty starting to see now how all of these things they all sort of make sense. They're all as one, aren't they? Okay, reasons for public expenditure. Well, we want to spend money on merit goods because otherwise they'd be underprovided by the market system. We want to spend money on public goods like defence, otherwise they may not even be produced by the private sector. And we may want to increase G because of Keynes's argument in a recession. There may be a lack of demand, wages may not be falling, and if there's a lack of demand, then we want to increase G to stimulate growth, and by stimulating growth then we get more taxation revenue back. The multiple accelerator kicks in and we're going to get more revenue back in the long term. So this is just going through the detail of all these different things. It's lesson 89 on fiscal policy. Thank you. What I'm doing in this session is I'm just going through the details behind this particular part of the course. We're not looking at the big picture, we're looking at sort of individual things on there. Sorry, it's just a mosquito flying out in front of me. Right, why governments levy taxes? Well, they levy taxes for a number of reasons. They've got to pay for merit goods, they've got to pay for public goods, they may want to increase taxes to decrease the level of economic activity in the UK. They may want to increase taxes to pay off the national debt. They want to redistribute. They also want to redistribute income. Okay, so that's the reason why we have a taxation system. Different types of taxes. A direct tax is levied directly on an individual or organisation. So income tax is a direct tax from there. An indirect tax is a tax on a good or services, like VAT, for instance. So you don't have to pay it. It's only when you buy that service that you're going to actually pay that tax. And then you have different types of taxes. Some are progressive, some are regressive, and some are proportional. A progressive tax is a tax which is dependent upon your level of income. The more you earn, the greater proportion of that income you will pay in tax. A regressive tax is when you will pay a greater proportion of your income on that tax, and regressive is the low income households pay a greater proportion of their income on that tax. E.g., when you buy a bottle of alcohol, if you're really rich, a millionaire, you pay the same amount of tax as you would if you were on a low income. Proportional tax is what it says, is one where the proportion paid in tax remains the same even if the income changes. Okay, so those are three different types of taxation system. The principles of taxation, well, the big two are it must be efficient and it must be fair. Now, there is a conflict there because if you decrease corporation tax, that is seen as being efficient because it creates more investment. However, it's not particularly equitable because shareholders tend to be wealthier. They own shares in companies, so the lower the corporation tax, the more dividends that they will make. The same with income tax. If you decrease income tax, it's more efficient because people like to work harder. They're more likely to go out to work. However, it is less equitable. Clearly, the most equitable tax will be the progressive tax. The more you earn, the greater your proportion of income which will be paid in taxation. Also, we're looking, they should also be efficient, which is what I've just explained on there. The cost of collection should be low, it should be certain, people should be able to understand the tax, and it should be predictable in terms of how much you're going to collect. Now, you're not going to get a great big question on this, but it's a bit of a brain dump sort of question. You just have to learn what are the principles of the taxation. It should be efficient, should be equitable, should be easy to collect, should be predictable in the amount of money that's brought in each time. People should understand it, and people should know when they have to pay that level of taxation. Okay, on here, so I'm just going to give you the syllabus also tells us to talk about some taxes that are out there. Well, take value-added tax, which is clearly a regressive tax, and when the government came to power, that's the one tax that they did increase, and they increased it from 17.5% to 20%. Now, in a sense, that was an efficient way of doing things because, one, they want people to spend less money on imports, which is maybe a good thing. But the other reason is also because it collects in an extra £10 billion a year. So therefore, what you are telling all of your bondholders and everybody else, that when you want to sell bonds on the open market, you're actually tackling the deficit to the tune of £10 billion a year. Okay, but corporation tax. Under Gordon Brown, he started to reduce corporation tax. At one stage it was 30%. It's now right down to 21%. Right, and this is seen as being a highly efficient move because you're creating more investment. In fact, if you believe in the Laffer curve, you're going to get more revenue back. However, it's also less equitable because shareholders are going to make more money. Income tax, the top rate of income tax, which is paid roughly over £40,000 a year. The top rate of tax was at 40%. They then put it up to 50%, and now it's gone down again to 45%. Now, clearly that is progressive because the first £10,000 you earn in the UK is completely tax-free. Anything over £40,000, you're going to be paying 40%, and then 50% or 45%, whatever they've decided on at that time. So it is very much a progressive tax. However, the problem here is if you have the tax rate at 50%, then people may decide to move abroad, so therefore you get less taxation revenue back. You become known as a high tax, high spend economy, so therefore the supply side is not as strong. So eventually we moved on to compromise of 45%. However, I suspect under the Tories it may well go down again. The Labour Party will say that they will increase it. Clearly, inheritance tax is a progressive tax. However, you can earn up to £225,000 tax-free when someone's inheritance is passed on to someone else. Okay, so on here is just information about taxes. Why do we levy taxes? What are direct taxes? What are indirect taxes? Progressive, regressive, proportional. What are the bases of a good taxation system? And these are some examples of what's happened with tax. This is regressive. This is less equity, and more equity, but actually really annoys people because they want to pass on their inheritance that they worked hard for to their children, and they complain when they have to pay that tax. Okay, lesson 89, second session on fiscal policy. Lesson 89, fiscal policy, and here we are talking about more detail in terms of fiscal policy and looking first of all at the relationship between the budget balance and the national debt. The budget deficit is a deficit on a yearly basis. Now, as you will know, as you've listened to all these talks, the UK has been in a budget deficit since 2001, and it's actually quite rare for it ever to be in a budget surplus. It was in a budget surplus when Labour first got to power in 1997 to 2001 because they wanted to prove to people that they were economically competent. So national debt fell quite rapidly as a percentage of GDP. I always quite like this figure in here. Roughly in the year 2000, the national debt was 30% of GDP. By 2007, it was 40% of GDP. By 2013, it's roughly 80% of GDP. And maybe by the year 2017, it will have reached 100% of GDP. So if our GDP is £1.5 trillion a year, in this year, our national debt will also be £1.5 trillion. In 2011, we had a record budget deficit of roughly 12%. That was when we were trying to get out of the recessionary cycle that we were in due to the credit crunch in 2008. So at some stage, this has to be controlled. The next thing that's on the syllabus is a thing that's called the structural budget deficit. Now, what this really means is if an economy is doing pretty well, so say if the UK economy is growing at 3% a year, and you're still running a budget deficit, this is not good, because that means that the budget deficit is structural. Okay, normally when you have high economic growth like we did between 2001 and 2007, then really you should be running budget surpluses, even though Gordon Brown decided to run budget deficits every single year. And I'm saying it's such a shame because really during this period of time, our national debt needn't have been 30% of GDP. It could have been, by the year 2007, it could have been 20% or even less of GDP. And that would have made the economy much stronger. Now, one of the problems is, because the government's like spending money because it gets them more votes, is that we've been running a structural budget deficit for a long period of time now. So even if the economy is doing well, we would still have a budget deficit. This is in contrast to a cyclical budget deficit, and this quite rightly says that in a recession it's likely that the government's going to be spending more money. So in a recession you would have a budget deficit, whereas in a boom period you would have a budget surpluses, and then hopefully they would hopefully the budgets and surpluses would cancel each other out. Okay, now there are consequences of a budget deficit for macro performance, because a budget deficit will lead on to a national debt. We've already covered these. You're going to get the crowding out effect because the government has to sell bonds to the private sector. Therefore, the private sector doesn't put the money into shares or the banks. So this takes money away from the private sector. We may lose we've already lost our AAA rating, but we may get an even lower rating. If we get a lower rating, then every time we sell a bond, we've got to pay a higher rate of interest on that money that we borrow. Higher debt repayments, obviously, the higher level of national debt. I think right now in the year 2013, I think we paid £63 billion in debt repayments every single year. It may also mean, of course, in the future, we have to have higher taxes. Higher taxes creates less enterprise. We may even have higher taxes and that may actually reduce the taxation revenue because there's less enterprise within the economy. And it just generally breeds less confidence in an economy. And ultimately, of course, is if your national debt gets too large, you can't pay it back. If you can't pay it back, then the government effectively goes bust, and then it can't pay firemen, teachers, nurses, doctors, and your whole system starts to break down. So you don't want to have high levels of national debt because it creates a lack of confidence in your economy. There's a great line in Kalecki's book, Capitalism 4, where he really talks about all of this. He says, well, what we can do is we can just print some money and that would have to pay off the debt. And it sounds quite laughable, but that's actually what we did. I think we paid off about £220 billion worth of debt by just printing money and actually paying it off. At some stage, the governments may sell bonds again, but at this moment in time, you could actually print money. Obviously, if you paid off the whole debt by printing money, that really would create inflation. And actually, it'd be much harder to sell your bonds in the future because the people would know that you just print the money, and if you print the money, that's going to create inflation. That means the bond that they buy will be worth less in real terms. But basically, the larger the national debt, it's going to be harder and harder to sell bonds. And the best example of this is Greece. If Greece wants to sell a bond, at some stage, they'd have to pay a rate of interest of 30% because that was seen as very high risk because there's a possibility that the government would go bust. Whereas in the year 2013, the UK and Germany were able to borrow money at almost 2%. And the reason for that is that we were seen as a pretty safe bet in terms of not going bust. So therefore, it was a good, safe investment to make. In terms of fiscal policy, this is quite interesting because previously Gordon Brown decided to have some rules as regards fiscal policy. And the reason why I had those rules was it was a good idea, because if you have fiscal rules, then that creates more confidence in your economy, and if there's more confidence in your economy, that's going to create more investment. However, if you create a rule, you don't really want to break it. Well, this is exactly what happened with Gordon Brown, and to blame him totally is a little bit harsh. However, you can blame him for, during this period of time, is that he continually ran budget deficits in the good times, and that led to a high level of national debt. But he had two rules. One of them was the sustainable investment rule, that your national debt should never be more than 40% of your GDP. Obviously right now we've absolutely smashed that one. So that was his first rule that he created. And the next one was the golden rule of borrowing, which was over a 10-year period, that your deficits should equal your surpluses apart from money that's spent on capital expenditure. So by having these rules, he created more confidence in our fiscal policy. However, since then he's gone and broken those rules. Well, he's no longer in power, but he actually broke those rules, so that creates less confidence in your system. But I think it's quite a good idea to have rules. However, what we now have this term, which I'm going to talk about in a second or two, called fiscal sustainability, and I'm going to talk about the Office for Budget Responsibility. Okay, lesson 89, finito. Okay, this is lesson 89, and this is the last session going through the details on fiscal policy, and thank heavens for that. Okay, so I quite like to start off with a little quote here from Jeremy Warner, and he says you cannot get economic growth until fiscal policy is put on a sustainable path. In fact, I think he actually says until you have fiscal sustainability, the economy cannot recover. It was something like that. Anyway, but what he's suggesting is you must have a fiscal policy which does not have a structural deficit, and that there is confidence, there's clear confidence in terms of what you're doing with your fiscal policy. And we're sort of starting to get that because we are getting the government finances under control, but we've still got a very, very large national debt. Okay, so basically what is fiscal sustainability? It's a vague term that people like to use. And remember in the previous sort of section I was just talking about Gordon Brown, and Gordon Brown was talking about that he invented these two rules, the golden rule of borrowing, which he broke, and he smashed up completely the sustainable investment rule, which was that your national debt should not be more than 40% of GDP. But of course, Gordon Brown also abolished boom and bust, so he would never have realised that there's going to be a massive, great big bust, so that's why national debt increased so rapidly. However, right, so what they did was in 2010, when George Osborne came to power, he created an independent body called the Office for Budget Responsibility, and I think this is a pretty good move. Perhaps we should also have one for the environment. Anyway, but we had one for fiscal policy. And basically they will come up with some pretty some things that are not popular. So I think in a way the government can say, well, it's the Office for Budget Responsibility has said, for example, that we must increase the state's retirement age to maybe 66 or 67, otherwise the country will actually go bust. So therefore we will introduce these reforms. So it introduces long-term fiscal reforms, and its job is to report on the sustainability of public finances. So it's very, very transparent, and it's very open to the public at large, so people know what's going on, and they're independent of the, or they're meant to be independent of the government from there. So it's just an independent body that looks at fiscal policy, and the key part of that is sustainability. You mentioned the word quite a few times on here, to talk about the sustainability of public finances, And Jeremy Warner says we cannot get economic growth until fiscal policy is put on a sustainable path. And I would say that maybe by increasing VAT by 2.5% to 20%, so the government gets an extra £10 billion a year, that is a hint that is starting to move towards sustainable finances, even though it will be the poor who suffer most. End of lesson 89, fiscal policy.